78 Chapter 17. Chapter 17 Ancient Foes. Team Aquino, Mansion Le Barton, France. Hello, the word seemed soft, so very soft, as it came from Aquino's lips. This was the girl she loved. No, Rias was more than that. She was a beautiful young woman, so why should she be feeling so awkward now? Babe, I need to talk to you. Emotion was overflowing from each word that Rias spoke. It filled her voice, and Aquino knew why. She had just watched The Reason, and it was tearing her up inside. She still wanted to know why it took her girlfriend so long to reach out to her, but knew that it had something to do with the actions or reactions of Kiba's team. Aquino wouldn't let her girlfriend fret though, and spoke up to let it be easier on her. I know what happened. I've seen the footage. Please just tell me he's alive. Aquino tried to keep her voice from becoming an outright plea. She wasn't fully successful though. Rias let out a sigh that was full of held-back worries, anxiety, and carried a modicum of relief. He's stable, recovering. Everything that can done, has been done. The words took a massive weight away from Aquino's stomach. Nerves and concern still remained, however it was greatly reduced by knowing that the headstrong saiyan boy had survived the ordeal so far. Rias, Aquino began, using her name, a subtle way of letting her girlfriend know that something was a bit off and she couldn't speak completely freely. I am currently in the presence of Duke John Le Barton and his retinue. He wishes to speak with you as well. Are you happy for me to switch to loudspeaker? Immediately Aquino could tell the change in her girlfriend's voice. Rias wanted to speak with her, lover to lover, however the present situation didn't allow that, and so she had to let her know what the situation on her end had become. Aquino loathed the idea of not supporting Rias fully, but she also couldn't create a scenario that was rude to the proud noble who had so far gone out of his way to help them. As she placed the phone down and shifted the audio to loud, Rias' voice changed. Years of grooming and practice allowed the heiress to shift in these formal situations fluidly. Greetings, Duke Le Barton. I do very much hope that you are well. Rias' voice entirely diplomatic, authoritative, and yet open. The exact tone expected when dealing with foreign nobility. I am, thank you, Lady Gremory. I understand part of the situation that you're currently undertaking. Know that my house agrees with the assessment of Lord Sursex. We will provide any and all assistance that we can to your agents in our domain. Duke Le Barton's voice is well suited to the intricacies of court politics, which, considering his age and experience over the past centuries, was to be expected. It is within our knowledge that your agents abroad have engaged the enemy. Is there any more information that you could provide to advise why the enemy may have come to our realm? The Duke's request was more than reasonable, and Aquino hoped that Rias wouldn't see reason to withhold information. While Aquino was understandably worried for Issei, she was still committed to her task and would do what was required. Over the next hour Rias relayed the full report of the actions of Kiba's team, the nature of the dark crystals piquing the interest of the Duke. Sebastian, Marie and Aquino remained silent throughout the exchange. The Le Barton Devils providing research assistance to the Duke throughout the conversation by scouring the internet of both the mortal and supernatural domains for any mentions of activities occurring within France. With the two overt actions of Moscow and Peru, it was clear that their enemy was willing to discard the guise of secrecy. Although Aquino pondered, perhaps Moscow was more the will of science than the enemy. Rias and John discussed the possible attributes and nature of the dark crystals, the reports of Ravel's initial witness at Reiser's murder of his peerage and Kiba's forming the large basis. Their information being supplemented with a constant string of updates being brought to Rias by servants of Ajuka, the inventive Satan agreeing to share each discovery as he found it. As best to help those in the field being his reasoning. It was clear that the spell Reiser used to become the massive phoenix against Issei in the raiding game was a weaker version of the one he used to sacrifice his peerage, and in turn that spell was what, or a variation of which, was being used to, for lack of a better word, harvest the citizens in Peru. Aquino found it sickening as she listened to the description of what had occurred. Sure, devils were selfish, it was ultimately what separated them from angels. There was an absolute litany of little surface issues, but at the very core of it the initial split was over one issue. Angels saw the ultimate purpose of themselves being to work for others, while devils saw the ultimate purpose of their being as to work for themselves. Many took this drive for the self to mean evil, but that was a naive approach. Aquino could see the full picture. Anyone with their eyes open could. What humans called capitalism was them working for their own needs, and through that they had lifted millions out of poverty and developed rapidly over a single century. Devils were the same as that. They didn't want mindless carnage and destruction like demons, or to try and hold high-minded ideals like angels. But what the fallen angels had done, that Aquino considered evil. They believed that they fought for others and had all the altruism of the angels of heaven, and yet their barbarism and brutality made them different. Twisted in nature, they became selfish, yet saw all others as a threat, mortals as mere cattle, and all other factions of the supernatural as their enemy. If anyone was evil, then Aquino was certain that it was them. Aquino came out of her thoughts and was lucky to find that the conversation was reaching the crux of the issue. Where would the agents of Coquebel and Reiser be in France, and to what primary purpose? The Duc was certain that they wouldn't be in Paris. It was far too risky, and anything of value to them would have been destroyed during the Middle Ages. Paris was at one point in time very close to being the absolute center of Christendom for Western Europe. Not exactly somewhere that ancient magic thrived or even had a chance to remain. Aquino checked the time on her phone. Close to 4 in the morning. Little could be confirmed, as the news cycle was just repeating the footage it had in building upon speculation and conjecture. The conversation between the two nobles came to an end, and Aquino switched the loudspeaker off as she went to farewell Rias. "Be safe, my love," the red-haired Gremory heiress stated in a voice that sounded concerned, tired, and clearly missing her. "I will, you too." As much of a response as Aquino could give at this time. The Duc appeared in deep thought, whilst both Sebastian and Marie continued to work around the table. It seems that Lady Gremory's peerage has weathered quite the horrendous storm in this venture. Not the outcome that Lord Surzax would have been hoping for. His voice filled with concern. Aquino simply nodded, as she couldn't find any words for the state of the peerage that she felt heavily attached to. Issei in a critical conditions, Kiba heavily wounded, Asia exhausted, and one of their holy allies dead. It was then that the Duc mentioned something a bit more personal. "You care deeply for the saiyan, don't you?" Aquino looked up to him before nodding. "He is an amazing guy. There is no other like him." Her words sincere and heartfelt. Devils often accepted unconventional relationships, but Aquino wanted to avoid the trio of her romance becoming public. That might have been a bridge too far. It seemed that the Duc had only noticed her affections for Issei, and that would be fine. "I believe that we all have a full picture of the situation now. You should return to resting, mademoiselle. We will put out more feelers and track down any information that we can." "Thank you, your lordship." Aquino responded with a genuine smile. When she agreed to the plan of making contact with local devils, she never expected the Duc to be so approachable and helpful. It was a surprisingly pleasant turn of events. Departing the parlor, Aquino moved slowly back through the finely decorated halls toward the Poitiers wing. Her mind struggled to move on from the state of Issei and how much she wanted to be with him and Rias. However, another thought, one that had been constantly there since before they departed Japan, continued to float around her head. Coquebel was here. That thought made her clench her fist as she entered her bedroom. Releasing a breath on the tight fist, she stripped off and slipped back into her night clothes before sliding back into bed. Sunlight drifted lightly across her soft features and irritated the closed eyes of Ravel Phoenix, rousing her from her blissful slumber. Sitting up in the comfortable bed, the blonde noble rolled her shoulders and stretched her arms out. The bed that was provided to her proved to be one of the most satisfying and refreshing that she had slept in over the last week, comparable to her own before the incident with her brother. She showered, having been too tired the night before and feeling rather foul for it, spent the following half an hour preparing herself and departed the room that had been given to her. Ravel took pride in always presenting a flawless image, an example of what a noble devil should be, and she wouldn't allow being sent around the world with the Gremory devils to detract from that. The hallways of the Poitiers wing proved to be completely silent. Ravel found it odd. In the Phoenix mansion, a steady supply of servants and house staff moved around constantly. However, here it appeared that no one was even awake. A cultural nuance of Europe that she was unaware of, perhaps. Some cultures were far more relaxed, moved with a different urgency or priorities lay differently. It didn't matter, this wasn't her domain, and so what happened here was none of her concern. She considered knocking on Akino's door opposite her but chose better. She didn't want to bother their leader and would rather fill her time in on her own accord. At that, she decided to follow the hall around to where Sarah and Kaniko's rooms were situated. As she did, she found the youngest devil sitting against the door looking at her phone. The white-haired Nakomata not present, but considering her injuries that night before, it was perfectly reasonable and sensible that she would not yet have risen. If she was being smart, then she would rest and allow her body to heal and recuperate properly before trying to move around. But with the stubbornness of these Gremory devils, who knew what she would do? "Good morning, what are you watching?" Ravel asked in a friendly tone as she moved next to the smaller girl. She was aware that she hadn't endeared herself so well to the pawn and rook of Rias Gremory. She planned to remedy that as best as possible. Team dynamics were important. The young girl didn't respond or even acknowledge Ravel, instead continuing to stare at her screen while the soft volume of the audio played from it. Instantly, Ravel felt the pang of annoyance at the rudeness of the girl toward her. Here she was trying to build bridges and the girl wouldn't even give her the time of day. "I said hello," Ravel stated once more, her tone more forceful while also nudging the young girl with her foot as she stood beside her. Sarah's head turned toward her but went back to the screen as she pointed to the screen. The look on her face a mix of shock, horror, and befuddlement. Ravel was taken aback. It was in no way a reaction she had expected. Dropping down beside her, Ravel looked onto the screen and was not prepared for what she saw. Issei wrapped in a red aura that she took to be that of his Kaioken form, an easy guess from the multiple descriptions she had been informed of, battling another figure adorned in a golden aura that Ravel could only describe as majestic. This was on YouTube and Ravel found that distressing but not as much as what she was witnessing. She had not had much to do with the Gremory scion, but she was well aware that he was immensely powerful, maybe more so than the Satans, and yet now he was being beaten and battered around like a ragdoll. Sarah's reaction now made perfect sense. Her shock at this was just as high. Both girls watched as Issei unleashed a Gallic gun the size of which they had never witnessed before, only for it to do very little to his opponent, and then his struggle become absolutely nothing as his power appeared to vanish utterly and he plummeted from the sky, collapsing to the ground. The last minute was even more distressing as they saw Rias protect the scion who was clearly on death's door before their assailants left, and she teleported away. All viewed by humans. The video finished and Sarah just let the next video autoplay without any thought as she turned to Ravel. "Did you say something, Ravel?" The younger girl, clearly unaware of what had been said to her, having been so absorbed in the video. "Don't worry about that." "What the hell is going on with that video?" Ravel asked in genuine concern. She didn't have very firm personal relationships with the Gremory devils yet, but two things concerned her. Many millennia of supernatural secrecy seemed to have been undone. What did that mean for all of them? The underworld would be in absolute turmoil, and secondly, Issei had been so utterly thrashed. She found the scion cocky, arrogant and rude, but he was also kind, caring and beyond powerful. Without a doubt the most powerful of their group, and he had been handled so easily by the Golden Warrior. A Golden Warrior who had a tail as well. "I don't know," Sarah responded. "Can you put the end of the video on again?" Ravel asked as she wanted to confirm her suspicion. Sarah did without complaint, and instantly Ravel felt uncomfortable. "Oh no." She sighed as it instantly clicked. "What, Ravel?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious, and Ravel realized that the young girl wouldn't have been analyzing the content or its implications. "His tail," Ravel replied, pointing at the Golden Warrior's rear appendage as he fought across the screen. "He is the scion that Issei was tracking. The one with Valley." Sarah let the video finish before putting her phone away and standing up. It was clear that the young devil wasn't sure of what exactly she should be doing. Feeling mercy for the younger girl, Ravel took charge and moved over to Kaniko's room. Sarah followed her, happy to be doing something with the older girl. Kaniko's door was unlocked, but after opening it as quietly as possible they found the shades drawn and the room very dark. Tiptoeing in, the pair found the white-haired Nikomata still very much asleep. Her bed was heavily disheveled and it showed that she had found sleep quite difficult to attain. Ravel wasn't surprised. The pink tinge gracing the bandages around her wounds showed that unfortunately at some point during the night the wound had seeped or possibly torn slightly. Bringing the sheets up lightly to keep her warm, the two devils then backed out quietly. Once returned to the hallway and away from the wounded Nikomata's room, Ravel turned to Sarah. "Have you had breakfast yet?" Sarah looked up at her with a slight smile while shaking her head in the negative. Ravel led the way forward to explore the estate and find the dining room, or if there wasn't food already available, then the kitchen. "Let's go get something then." Sarah's smile widened as she happily followed the senior devil. It took the pair almost 20 minutes to find the dining room. They found bedrooms, ridiculously large storage closets, an extremely messy study, a library that was so neat that the only explanation could be magic, rooms full of varied antiques collected through the centuries, an indoor gym that Sarah commented would probably be able to satisfy issei for only a few minutes, and then even more formal rooms including a billiard and darts room before they came to the dining room in the lion's wing. The dining room featured an elaborate, well-crafted and beautiful stained wooden table that could easily seat 20 with room to spare. Currently it only had one occupant. Sebastian sat at the far end of the table, two laptops and a tablet along with his phone and hundreds of printed sheets of collected information and tidbits spread out in front of him. He appeared to be engrossed in work with a slightly stiff and rough appearance that told Ravel that he hadn't slept during the previous night. As the girls entered, he looked up and Ravel felt a pang of guilt for interrupting him. "Oh, I am so sorry. We didn't mean to intrude," Ravel offered quickly. "Not at all," his smile genuine across his handsome face. "I had been curious as to when you would all awaken. I imagine that you are both hungry." Ravel went to answer diplomatically but found her efforts undercut by Sarah, who nodded emphatically, "Very." The younger girl replied earnestly. Sebastian rose to his feet, indicating for them to sit at the table wherever they pleased as he made his way to an adjacent doorway. Opening it briefly, he spoke with someone whom the girls couldn't see before turning around to address them. "The cook will have food brought out for you shortly." As he returned to his work, both girls sat in silence after thanking him. Ravel was content to sit in silence. She was in another noble family's home and wished to cause as minimum intrusion as possible. Her associate, however, felt differently, and as Sarah began to speak, Ravel groaned inside. The casual nature of the Gremery family and their compassion with peerage members was well known in the underworld, yet at this time Ravel wished that Sarah had been taught a bit more decorum. "What are you working on there?" the young girl asked toward the engrossed Frenchman. Ravel had to bite her tongue to avoid scolding Sarah directly and only hoped that she would be able to apologize to Sebastian before the younger girl became too much of an annoyance. However, the look that Sebastian gave the youthful devil wasn't what Ravel had expected. Instead of anger or annoyance, he looked at her in mild surprise before smiling and patting the chair beside him. An invitation to move closer. Ravel watched as Sarah picked up from her spot opposite from herself and moved to sit beside the busy man. "I am searching through all the known magical sites in northern France, cross-referencing them with rumored sightings of Riser Phoenix or Gregory, and then trying to narrow down our search pool for where the most relevant sites for your team to conduct a ground operation would be," he explained effortlessly while pointing to various pieces of paper and opening windows on the devices for Sarah to see. The young girl remained quiet, simply nodding as he went. The girl was absorbing everything he said. "What about that?" she stated as he finished, pointing at something Ravel couldn't see on one of the laptops. "It's the draft of my report so far to the Duke and Lady Aquino. My analysis of the sites, potential for relevance to the enemy, and finally, my recommendation on where I think your team should go first." His answer piqued Ravel's interest. She really wanted to know where he thought that they should be exploring or targeting first, but she also didn't want to pry. She wasn't sure if she was more annoyed or thankful that Sarah didn't hold such reservations. "Where should we go then?" Sarah asking the logical question without any thought of protocol or formalities. Sebastian took a quick drink from the glass of water beside himself before responding. "I think I should wait for his lordship and Lady Aquino before we discuss this further." They were both up late and Lady Aquino had quite a stressful event. Sarah again responded before Ravel could intervene. Yeah, Issei got pretty beat up, huh? Ravel wanted nothing more than to faceplant at the blasé nature of Sarah. However, Sebastian merely chuckled in a manner that showed he found her attitude endearing. You could say that, but I do not know the man, so I would rather not comment. Ravel couldn't take any more of not being involved. She just had to know what the Lou Barton devil had been researching. Standing up abruptly, the motion of which caused her chair to tilt and fall, promptly gained both other devils' attention as she stood awkwardly rigid. Can I also see what you have done, only if you don't mind? She forced out, the final string of words racing from her lips. Both seated devils stared at her blankly for a moment before looking to each other. In unison, they both broke into fits of laughter and Ravel felt her cheeks begin to burn red with pangs of annoyance building within herself. Were they mocking her? Flames materialized on her hand as she pointed her right hand at Sarah. Don't mock me. Why can't I know too? She demanded of them with the words directed towards Sarah. The reaction wasn't what she expected, with Sebastian going mildly wide-eyed and stopping his laughter as he tried to begin an apology. However, Sarah continued to laugh, if possibly even harder. Words did escape her lips though, words that irritated and yet paused Ravel. We aren't mocking you. Ravel extinguished the fire and stared at the younger girl, who finally gained enough control of her outburst to sit upright and open both arms toward Ravel while indicating to her. You are so rigid. All formal and stuff. Just relax and come look at it with me. Sebastian doesn't mind, right? Sarah stated plainly with the final question toward the man beside her. He was uncertain as he replied. Of course not, if Lady Phoenix wishes to see, then I have no problem at all. Sarah gave the older girl a large smile. See, it's fine. You need to chill. You know, like Issei and all of us. You are far too formal. It is probably why Issei said you have a stick up your butt, or whatever that means. But maybe not as relaxed as he is, because you know, he does stuff like regularly trying to challenge Lord Surzex. What? Ravel and Sebastian both replied. Unbeknownst to Ravel, Sarah's demeanor and change in conversation had caused her to relax and stand casually. At first she was grated by the scion's choice in expression when describing her, but that went out the window at the thought that he actually openly challenged a ruler of hell. Yeah, they often try to outmatch each other. I also overheard Lady Grafia tell Aquino that when Issei found out about how Rias was being forced to marry your brother, Lord Surzex accidentally used the word sacrificed and Issei smacked him so hard that he couldn't speak. Sarah then smirked before quickly adding a caveat to her comment. But don't tell Issei, Lady Grafia says his head is big enough already without knowing he can probably go toe-to-toe with Lord Surzex. Ravel wasn't sure how to respond, the scion's attitude was just so foreign to her, and it was only when Sebastian decided to change the conversation that she realized she had walked around and sat beside him to the other side of where Sarah was. So as I was saying to Miss Sarah, these are the locations I am checking. He began, and Ravel found herself smiling through his description and not even noticing the plate of food that was placed down in front of her. His eyes holding her attention far better than the food ever could. Asterisk Gramarye Mansion, hell asterisk. Rias was restless. It had been over 3 hours since she finished her call with Aquino and Duke Labarton. Kiba, Asia, and Irina were all resting. Their injuries treated and then put to bed. Asia had tried to insist on using her magic to help Issei, but Rias hadn't allowed it. Her magic was so depleted that Rias wasn't going to risk another member reaching the level of exhaustion that Issei had. Granted, he drained all 3 aspects of ki as he fought against Biko, where his devil magic only lowered a person's store of shoki, but that was beyond the point. She wouldn't risk it. Now that they were all asleep though, she had little to do other than sit in his room and watch his body heal. What she wanted more than anything was to speak with Drake or enter her boyfriend's mindscape. To have the opportunity to find out exactly what was happening, but she couldn't as she had so far been unable to make contact regardless of how many times she tried. In response to her frustration, she wandered the estate. She roamed aimlessly all over the gardens and the lower levels, but everywhere brought up images of Issei or Aquino. She didn't have either at the moment, and it caused her to be infuriatingly lonesome. The garden where he first transformed in the giant ape. The room where Akino and her first spent time together after she became her queen. Her bedroom where they all became so much more. She couldn't just go speak with her brother or parents either. They had the fallout of this mess to deal with. Heck, they had to devise a way to either cover up what had happened, which was a lost cause by this point, or to make contact with humanity. Governments, important organizations, societies. It was a monstrous job, and one that Rias knew she couldn't interrupt right now. What a great time to shit the bed, so to speak, right when they were going into a potential shadow war against Kokobile. Her restlessness brought her back to the main entranceway to the great mansion. What she didn't expect to see though was Grafia moving down into the west wing. Weren't they all in the upper east wing? But then again, Grafia had been with Ajuka. Rias followed after her with the hopes of catching up and speaking with her sister-in-law. Grafia entered a storage room toward the entrance of the west wing, and Rias opened the doorway behind her to address her. Her brother's queen and wife was busily rummaging around the shelves, digging into boxes and crates. "Hey, what are you looking for?" Rias announced her arrival, trying to keep her voice as relaxed as possible. More to convince herself than Grafia. "Oh, Rias," Grafia replied in a voice that was clearly distracted. "Just looking for some malatone quartz." Rias rested herself up against the doorframe. "Why? What's it for?" "Ajuka's new device. The one to assess the threat of someone. He needs it to build the lens." Grafia responded in short sentences as she continued to rummage through even more of the clutter that packed the overfilled storage room. Moving over and beginning her own search, Rias began to systematically help with the two, settling into a simple silence. Rias really wished that Grafia would start a conversation about something, anything to end her own thoughts from being the only thing going through her head. Normally Rias could talk to the older woman about anything and often confided in her, but right now she was simply at a loss. She just couldn't bring herself to start idle chit-chat. Papers, stationery, a pair of dusty old lamps. 6 romance novels that Rias remembered her mother reading when she was younger, and a spare light bulb. Nothing of any interest. Rias was about to ask Grafia if she was sure that the crystals were kept here when the older woman spoke up. "Aha, gotcha." She cheered, holding up an 8-inch box filled with discs of quartz, all roughly 5 inches in diameter and close to wafer thin. "Thanks, Rias," Grafia offered with a smile. "I'm going to get these over to Ajuka." "Can I come?" Rias quickly shot out. Grafia seemed to ponder for a moment before smiling at her in a sympathetic way. "Sure, I'm certain that Ajuka won't mind. Maybe you can help." Bashar greeted Rias with a warm smile as he held the door open for her to enter the elegant automobile. She responded with a smile of her own, although not as warm as she would usually display, and they chat about nothing of any importance for the length of the drive to the Beelzebub residence. It was generally a 40-minute drive, and although Rias wasn't sure how long it had taken, she was glad that her family's faithful retainer continued to be able to keep pressing events from her mind. The Beelzebub residence remained as strange as it always had. It would have looked suited to being a carnival funhouse or outlandish-themed circus ground. All thanks to some of the more eccentric inventions of the inventor Satan. Ajuka was always willing to devise new ways to achieve what he desired. A tower floated in front of the house itself 4 stories high but with solid stone walls and no entrance on the first or second story. The floating tower acting as a cable car would for a human lodge and ferried guests to the entrance at the center of the open court-style home on the 3rd floor. Rias had always enjoyed marveling at the absurdity of the building when she visited as a child. While standing in the small tower with Grafia, she allowed these happy thoughts to play through her mind as the unusual construct drifted over the high walls and down into the courtyard within the center of the home. A very excited and energetic Ajuka awaited the pair as they stepped from the floating entry tower. Without batting an eyelid at the younger Gremry's arrival, he spoke to Grafia. "Did you get it? I just know that I have got this design right if I can use the malatone quartz." "Oh hey Rias." The words came out just as excited as a young child, with him almost bouncing up and down, just like he was about to receive a Christmas present. He really never did change when he was close to a breakthrough. Grafia handed him the container and he pivoted sharply before leading the way into his estate. Rias trailed as the older pair discussed the design. She wasn't entirely sure what either were talking about, but she understood that when he referenced lenses and scanning the potential of someone, that they were referencing to the new device to track dangerous foes. It appeared they intended to make it some form of glasses or similar device. Once inside the home, it was no less different than the outside. Staircases that moved around with a mind of their own. Doors that led to different rooms if you said different passwords while moving through. It was a mixture of well-designed security and eccentricity. The group proceeded through a few rooms and halls before arriving at Ajuka's laboratory. Calling it a laboratory might not have been right though. The room also featured as a foundry, manufacturing presses for small products or machines that began mass-producing other items. The sales of these items were one of the driving factors behind the Beelzebub wealth. The industrious nature of Ajuka was something that rubbed a lot of other devil nobility the wrong way. Many traditionalists looked down upon the lower acts of trade and manufacturing, but the wealth that it had brought the Beelzebub family along with Ajuka's personal strength meant that there was very little they could do. He could outbuy them and show them up rather easily in a personal duel. Ajuka took the container to a workbench that contained welding and cutting devices. A powerful cutting laser being his implement of choice for this activity. He immediately began setting to work with Grafia's assistance, making and drawing out the general shape to be cut in the quartz. Rias considered moving over to watch, but favored wandering the room. It was of a massive size and contained so many half-built and theorized designs that she would be able to distract herself thoroughly. Furthermore, she didn't want to end up underfoot and getting in the way. Time began to pass while the elder devils worked upon the quartz, taking their time to ensure that all sizes were lined up meticulously before any cutting took place. Rias found herself playing with a device that was a small oval-shaped pill. At the top sat a button. She went to push it and Ajuka called over to her as if he could somehow tell exactly what she was doing without looking at her. "Make sure you throw it the moment you press that." With her curiosity piqued further now, she pressed the button and tossed the pill out. A small puff of smoke obscured the landing location of the pill, and when it had cleared, a Harley-Davidson motorbike lay on the floor. Aware of the outcome, Ajuka called over to her again as he remeasured a length to be cut. "Those capsules are close to ready. Currently able to store items up to a factor of 500 times their volume with no consideration for weight at all. The only issue is that when released the contents land haphazardly. It gets a bit messy. Once fixed, we think they will be a massive seller," he explained eagerly. Rias was once again truly impressed by his genius. Rias moved over to the bike and examined it thoroughly, attempting to work out how to revert it back to the capsule or how to put it back in, but Ajuka offered no advice and she couldn't find any indicator. She would have simply asked, but he now seemed even more engrossed in his project if the progressive rise in excitement in both his and Grafia's words were anything to go by. Lifting the bike up, she put its stand out before leaving it and continuing her exploration of the wonders that Ajuka had conjured up. The sound of the laser cutting filled the air as Rias came upon a small vial. A minuet amount of a glistening translucent powder filling the bottom. It had both a silver and white glow to it, almost as if the product couldn't decide which shade it wanted to shine. A small label was spread across the face of the finger-length vial. Carefully lifting it into her hands, she rolled the vial to read the contents. Genki. Shoki. Yuki. The three elements of ki. It took Rias a moment before the implications of what she was holding dawned on her. She was holding pure essence of ki. The product that Ajuka had utilized to make her key pieces. The raw elements of the power that flowed through all them in differing degrees, but more importantly the exact formula of what Issei drew upon. An idea sprang to life in her mind. It may not have been possible, but she had to explore it. Moving over to Ajuka and Grafia, Rias waited patiently until the laser stopped cutting through the quartz sheets. "Ajuka," she began, her voice more upbeat than it had been since she had returned to Hell. She wanted to keep a hold of herself, but hope was building in her and she couldn't stop it from infecting her spirit. The Satan looked at her as she held out the vial. Is this pure ki? It took the devil scientist but a mere glance before he replied happily, sure is. It's the remainder of what I extracted and infused into your ki pieces. I have been meaning to manufacture more, but it is a very long, tiring and costly process. Rias nodded at his response. This was going to be a big request and she was uncertain if she had anything to offer in return, but she couldn't help but ask. Could this help issei? She desperately wanted the answer to be yes. Ajuka paused his measurement confirmation for the next cut as he assumed an expression that was a clear indication of him concentrating on a less than tangible concept. He is in his current state as a result of the severe injuries and draining all the aspects of his ki to such ridiculously critical levels. His statement a form of clarification and Rias nodded earnestly that he was correct. While I suppose that receiving a boost of ki would definitely help. That is the same ki as was in all the pieces that supplemented him, so it should definitely be compatible. The issue would be delivery. You can't just feed it to him or inject it. His skin is too hard for a needle to pierce and his body would just metabolize it without absorbing it properly. Ajuka muttered his thoughts as he ticked them off before his eyes widened with that look that said he had a breakthrough. But we could use your king ki piece. Surzex told me that you are able to enter Issei's mind and speak with Draig within him. Again Rias acknowledged with a nod. She wouldn't risk speaking lest it caused him to lose his train of thought. It was for this reason that Rias figured that Grafia was also staying silent. Well, this is just a theorization, but if you absorb the remaining pure ki into yourself, storing it in the essence of your king ki piece, then you may be able to push it through yourself into issei. I'm not really sure, but go ahead and try. I wasn't going to use such a small amount of ki essence without synthesizing more. Rias understood what he intended at the conceptual level, but how exactly should she absorb the powdery substance? Mix it with water and drink it or rub it into her skin. As if he could read the blank expression on her face, Ajuka continued. Pour it into your hands and concentrate on the repository that is your king ki piece. The rest should take care of itself. With that said, he returned to working on his quartz lenses. Rias moved away to the furthest corner and sat cross-legged. Similar to how she often saw Issei sit when he meditated. Carefully she poured the precious powder into her left hand, while ensuring ever so diligently that every single iota was accounted for. Finally she closed her hands together, let her eyelids droop shut and then focused in on herself. She focused much like trying to find the entrance into Issei's mindscape, but into herself this time. The sounds of Ajuka and Grafia's voices slightly annoyed her as she tried to concentrate. It was distracting her even though she knew that she was the intruder here, so to speak. However, as the minutes ticked by she realized that she couldn't hear them anymore. Opening her eyes, Rias found herself in a black nothingness that was very similar to Issei's mindscape, however less warm. She looked around and found two figures standing before her. One close and one far. Each the same and yet colored differently. Giant, 20-foot-tall chess king pieces. Her evil king piece stood closest, a deep crimson red. From it emanated the blackness. It wasn't a cold aura, but not a warm one either. It was just an aura. The key king piece was much further away, far enough that Rias had to walk a few minutes through an almost disconcerting space of empty blackness to reach it. It stood in a deep royal purple and emanated a warmth that she realized was far more similar to the comforting heat that existed within Issei's mindscape. She also found that as she approached, the surroundings became lighter. Not white like Issei's, but far lighter. Reaching the king piece, Rias reached out her hands to touch it. Pleasant, soothing, comforting. Those were how she would describe touching it. The object hummed slightly at her touch and she knew what to do. The thought barely forming to concentrate on the king before it took effect. A great rush of energy and a pulse that threw her back close to the evil king piece. She landed on her buttocks and sprawled out. Looking all around herself. It was clear that her mindscape had changed. The key piece pulsed out far more energy that swirled and mingled with the surrounding blackness. No shades of gray, simply a white aura emanating from the key piece that shuffled and swirled with the black aura of the evil piece. The air felt moderately warmer, even when away from the key king piece. But the biggest difference was the rush of energy that Rias felt. She felt more powerful than she ever had. Was this how Issei always felt? Was this what he was developing? No wonder her boyfriend was so obsessed with training and growing stronger. This feeling could easily be addictive. Rias was concerned with the possibility of her body taking the power and using it. How long could the key piece hold it for within her? Would she be able to use it? Would it harm her? Best course of action now was getting to Issei as soon as possible. To that goal she once again focused before opening her eyes back in Ajuka's mansion. The first thing she noticed was Grafia and Ajuka standing close to her. Her sister-in-law held a worried expression across her face while the devil scientist had an expression of keen interest. "What's wrong?" she said, curiosity and slight worry filling her words. She noted quickly that she still felt the rush of the flowing ki. Grafia seemed to ponder words, but Ajuka spoke immediately. "An aura much like Issei's white ki aura flickered around you briefly. How do you feel?" It was touching to note that concern was still present in his voice. His only interest wasn't simply in the scientific. Although Rias suspected that it largely was. "I feel great. The ki is like an incredible rush of energy and I feel invincible," she stated while Ajuka noted down what she said whilst muttering to himself. Rias turned to Grafia. "Don't worry, I am keen to get this ki to Issei as quick as I can. I won't do anything reckless. I do know exactly why he is so obsessed with growing his ki and strength though. This feeling could be so very addictive." Grafia gave her an understanding smile as Rias excused herself before rushing out to leave the estate. Within minutes she was in front of Bashar, the chauffeur more than happy to take her back to the Gremory mansion. The ride back to Gremory home was swift and silent, with Rias finding herself feeling restless with the pure ki moving through her veins. Multiple times she felt tempted to tap into the power. Devil power only utilized the Shoki. To be able to harness the Genki and Yuki would be a first for a devil. It could lead to amazing breakthroughs. But Issei needed this. That single thought was all that kept her from succumbing to the temptation. Bounding through the grand mansion, she arrived at Issei's bedside as fast as she was possibly able to achieve. She almost threw herself into the seat pulled up beside him in her hurry before calming herself with a series of deep breaths. She raised her hands and lay one on his head and the other just below his ribs. The same point where he had first been injured by Rainier. She didn't need to even think, instantly the whitish silver flowed from her fingertips and into the incapacitated saiyan. As it did, his aura raged up around him, first like small wisps and then growing with the flow of ki until it burst forth in a size close to that of his first flight. As fast as it had come, was just how fast it contracted away. It was then that she felt a pull against her mind. Instincts flared and she began to resist the pull, throwing up mental barriers. However, she paused as she felt the familiarity of it. "Drag," she asked tentatively. "It is truly good to speak with you, young Rias," the great dragon replied. Before Rias could respond, he continued. "Focus and I will bring you in." With that she closed her eyes to enter Issei's mindscape once again. Team Aquino, Mansion Le Barton, France. Aquino awoke feeling a strange mix of rested and anxious. She had slept well, her phone indicating that it was almost noon, and yet she was filled with worries for Issei, Rias, and the situation that had been unfolding, which meant that mentally she didn't feel as if much had changed. The burden of succeeding still weighed down upon her in a manner that felt all too heavy. Exiting the bedroom, she found the halls to be washed in the warm light of the day and the smell of delicious food carried through the estate on the light breeze. Following her nose, Aquino soon found herself at the dining hall. The remainder of her team already present. Sarah and Ravel sat beside Sebastian. Kaneko across from them beside Marie, with the French noble assisting the injured Nikomata, much to the stoic smaller girl's embarrassment. The Duke sat at the head of the table, currently enjoying a light lunch. Grilled duck breast and a garden salad. Taking a seat to the far side of Kaneko, a plate was instantly presented to her by a staff member. Aquino thanked the man before turning to the Duke. Reading her intent, before she could even open her mouth, he spoke up. "Have something to eat first. You need to keep your strength up, and we may not have much time later. We can discuss everything after you've done that much." Aquino couldn't argue. She was eager to get to the task that had been assigned to her team, but at the moment she was hungry, didn't want to offend or argue with the Duke, and could see his logic easily. Despite her hunger, Aquino took her time to eat. A lady always ate correctly, and she was cognizant of appearing as her boyfriend did while consuming any meal, not that she thought she was even capable of ever eating that fast, but still didn't want to create the image. The idea of the Duke seeing Issei eat was something she didn't want to ever imagine happening. With all the meals consumed and the inevitable mess cleared away, Sebastian flourished a small portion of magic to generate a holographic screen in the center of the table. The various electronics used to conduct his reconnaissance and surveillance gone from the room to places unknown. He cleared his throat before beginning his presentation. "Good morning all." Or shortly to be afternoon. As we all are aware, it was suspected by Gremory House intelligence that Riser Phoenix and operatives of this shadow organization that he is working with are operating within French sovereign territory. I have scoured over the past night to confirm as much detail as possible, as well as conduct my own initial analysis of possible targets and motives. His words confident and well presented. It was instantly apparent to Aquino that Sebastian had extensive knowledge and experience in this form of delivery. Potentially in the form of military training or service. We have confirmed the sightings of Riser Phoenix as well as Grigori elements within our region. This confirmation has also solidified their relation in working together. So far 11 sightings have been fully confirmed, with close to another dozen still unverified. All the locations have been those of cultural importance and linked to Old Latin culture. Specifically around the fall of the Roman Empire. With this statement, the holographic monitor displayed images of Riser and a group of 5 individuals moving through various ruins over French and Belgian territory. All ruins that bore the signs of being of either ancient Roman construct or influenced by Latin design. The group of individuals included a blonde woman, 2 men with olive skin who appeared to be twins. Both sporting dark hair and almost black eyes. The final 2 had managed to avoid easy identification through the combination of the angle within the images, presenting only their backs and the use of cloaks or hoods. Sebastian continued his report as the images rotated around in the air above the table. The exact reason for the focus on Roman cultural sites can only be speculated at this time. However, I assess that it is in relation to the despicable act he conducted in the murder of his own peerage and the production of the mystery crystals that was intercepted and undermined by the team of Lady Gremory's Knight. Both occurrences appear to be based around the use of an ancient magic that was prohibited even in the time of Roman devils. The exact working of the spell is unknown. However, what I have been able to decipher is that it draws out the pure life of the victim to directly bolster the assailant. Other mentions include regenerative or resurrective properties. The relation to Kokobile and his group are unknown, but this spell is the most tantamount lead that we have so far. With that in mind, these are the locations where any reference to the spell can be located. With that, 9 locations showed on a world map. 4 in Italy. 2 in Germany and 3 in France. A single extra point then began to flash, highlighted in northern France. I believe that this is the target that our foes will be aiming for, the Battery d'Aysville. A fortification built by the Nazi regime as part of their Atlantic Wall defenses. The site was built atop an ancient Roman fort. Many strange occurrences have been reported through the centuries by locals and the German forces posted there in the Second World War. It was always suspected that the Roman fort contained arcane items, and imagery I attained from an associate last night showed signs of recent tampering despite all tourism and exploration being shut down by the local authorities. Images of the location floated through the air. Concrete and reinforced walls. Dug-in weapons positions and reinforced overhead coverings. It was easy for all present to see that it was an old military structure. Aquino simply sat and listened as the Duke as he discussed with Marie and Sebastian about the implications of such a position. She was more interested in what such a location could offer to Kokobile and his group. She was unable to connect the dots in her head of how he would utilize this magic. Clearly Riser planned to use it to attain more power. It was plain to see that he was hungry for the ability to defeat Issei. But she just couldn't work out what Kokobile was after. The connection to his supposed true god was something that would need to be found out later. "We will head there then," Akino declared. The room looked at her and she continued, "We have a lead. We will pursue it. If it is nothing, then we scratch it off the list. If it is something, then we catch them as soon as we can. We will leave as soon as possible." The Duke's face remained neutral before he spoke. "I understand, a bias to take action can be a valuable advantage. However, young Kaneko here is injured. May I suggest she remains behind in our care and Sebastian accompanies your party in her place?" Kaneko began to argue that she was able to still perform her duties, however the pain strain on her face as she attempted to sit forward to make her point rather undercut herself, and Akino overruled her immediately. "Thank you, Duke Barton. I truly appreciate the help and care that you have offered to us." At this Sebastian rose, excusing himself to prepare while Marie escorted a stubborn Kaneko back to her room for further rest. The look the Nikomata gave Akino as she passed would have appeared almost hostile to most others, however Akino knew Kaneko too well. She could see that the girl understood why she had been replaced and was simply defending her pride as a warrior for being forced to tap this one out. It was a sense of pride that had been enhanced by association with Issei. 20 minutes later, the group gathered at the entry foyer of the Lubarton estate to begin their travel across France to the site in northern Normandy. They would be taking the train for the same reasons that they took human air travel to reach the country, avoiding obvious detection on approaching the site. Sebastian wore a dark set of pants, sturdy boots, a royal blue collared shirt and dark jacket. Akino briefly caught sight of what she believed to be a hilt or handle on the left side of his hip under the jacket. He was prepared to engage in combat. The local station, Gare de Corbeil-Essens, was less than a 10-minute walk, so the group moved by foot. Human pedestrians looked at the group, not because they were odd, the group fit in quite well, but rather as Akino was aware due to herself and Ravel. The two girls had chosen to wear clothes that were intended for traveling yet still stylish and clearly flattering on their very attractive figures. Despite herself, Akino couldn't help but shake her hips a little as she walked to accentuate her appeal. Sarah was too young to garner such attention or understand it, and so found the repeated glances by those they passed, mostly men, to be odd. "A lot of people keep looking at us," she stated in a flat voice that announced her annoyance at the occurrence. "That's because of Akino," Ravel replied bluntly. The offending beauty simply smirked as she softly spoke back with a little tease. "Guilty, but I can't help who I am. Anyway, I'm not the only one who they are looking at." Being herself was making her feel more normal and less concerned for Issei, as well as dulling the intense pain of missing both him and Rias. "But you keep them looking back with the way you move," Ravel retorted, and Sebastian couldn't help the snort of amusement he stifled to suppress. "I believe you are right, mademoiselle. Lady Akino does enjoy letting her charms be known." His voice light and clearly non-accusatory. Akino replied with a broad smile and pushed forward to lead the way of the group, with Sarah bounding up beside her before reaching out to take her hand. Akino looked down to her left and smiled at the young girl as their fingers intertwined and the two walked along ahead. Instantly her flirtatious movement ended and Akino moved more in a manner that would be associated with a big sister strolling with her young sibling as the younger girl began a conversation about shopping that they would do on return to Japan. Sebastian noted this instant change, being a half-dozen paces behind, beside Ravel, and let his thoughts be known to the blonde daughter of House Phoenix. "Lady Akino cares deeply for Miss Sarah." His voice softer so as to try and avoid the forward pair hearing his comment. Ravel kept look toward him and saw his eyes on her as she replied with a light blush taking to her cheeks whilst under his gaze. "Yeah, it seems so. I haven't really been with them for very long, but Sarah is pretty attached to Akino and Kaneko," Ravel replied while constantly willing her blush to leave her face despite the lack of success in doing so. "I see." He replied as his smile took on a slightly cheeky nature, "And are you also attached, Lady Phoenix?" Ravel almost choked at the reply, the double meaning plain for her to read. The soft blush becoming far more pronounced as rosy cheeks, with her voice suddenly refusing to comply under her response, "Nah. No." She mumbled out, turning her face away from his. Instantly feeling very self-conscious. Ravel kept her gaze firmly planted on all the buildings across the road from them as they approached the station and allowed the sound of the conversation ahead of their pair to keep herself in silence until she arrived at the train station. Once upon the train, Sebastian having paid for the tickets for the women, despite their having money he insisted once again against French honor, the group moved through to the second-to-last carriage to find it empty of other travelers. Sarah plopped herself down in a four-seat booth against the window with Aquino sitting beside her. This left the opposite for Ravel and Sebastian. Offering her the window seat, Sebastian waited for Ravel to sit before taking the last himself. Aquino watched as Ravel seemed almost a mixture of reluctance and happy to sit by the French devil even if the first thing she did was stare out the window at the buildings passing by as the train began to move. The soft red glow to Ravel's cheeks told Aquino all that she needed to know, and the mischievous girl began to form a plot in her mind. She had 4 hours to pass until they arrived near Cannes. Leaning over, she nudged Sarah to gain the younger girl's attention. Before Sarah could turn to her and give the game away before it began though, she leant in and whispered softly in her ear. Ravel's blushing. She's got a crush on Sebastian. As Sarah turned to her, the grin on her face said that she would follow with any lead that Aquino chose to take. This however hadn't gone totally unnoticed by Ravel, who had pulled her vision over to the pair while half-heartedly ignoring the man beside her. Sebastian himself was busily checking for any updates via his phone to what could change their tactical objective. As always, Aquino believed in pushing things to begin with. Feigning a stretch and yawn, she pushed her chest out as she addressed the man beside Ravel. So Sebastian, you look like you work out a lot. Looks good. Nice and firm. She spoke with seductive tones and a flirtatious smile. The reaction from the pair almost had her break into laughter. If she wasn't so skilled at strategically flirting with others, then she just might. Sebastian had looked up at her and visibly been forced to swallow before coughing out a response about how he often enjoyed keeping up his strength. All the while trying to find anywhere to look other than the tight front of Aquino's top being pushed out toward him through her protracted stretching. Ravel, however, had whipped her head almost as if under tension toward the Gremmerie Queen and was now glaring pure daggers at her. Exactly the response that Aquino had been hoping for. The girl was so uptight that she would never make a move unless she was forced into it. Aquino reached forward and ran her fingers along the man's arm. It definitely shows, she continued in a smooth seductive tone while walking her fingers up and down his arm. She was pleasantly surprised to see that he had regained the majority of his composure and was now looking at her a bit skeptically, although still caught off guard. Girls like that. Say, are you single? He never got the chance to respond though, as that was apparently all it took to cause Ravel to let herself be known. Have you no shame? You are already in a committed relationship and yet you are trying with another. Can't other people like someone without you trying to grab them for yourself? Ravel snapped the words and then a moment later realized that her tactical mind had failed her. Usually she was so analytical, never being spontaneous and acting when all of the variables had been accounted for. But with her prim and proper upbringing, she had never encountered someone like Aquino before. Now she had gone and said too much. The victorious grins on both Gremmerie devils opposite her told her as much. Oh Ravel. Jealous are we? Someone you like, huh? Aquino began to tease, much to Ravel's misfortune. Meanwhile, Sebastian felt rather confused by Aquino's abrupt shifts in behavior. He knew from her reaction the previous night that she loved the scion, and yet here she was acting very flirtatious with him while Ravel became more and more defensive. It was then that the cogs slipped into place and he realized what the leading lady had done. Not what he expected, but at the same time he couldn't say he wasn't interested in Ravel. It was Sarah that broke the situation though, in a fashion that only she could, by suddenly standing up and causing everyone's attention to turn to her. Oh. I get it now. she exclaimed, continuing before either older girl could stop her. Ravel likes Mr. Sebastian, but she is too uptight and snooty to say it, so you acted all flirty to him to make her jealous and say the wrong thing. Sarah looked incredibly proud of her figuring the situation out, while the other three all had different reactions. Sebastian was once again blown away by the bluntness of the girl and had to remind himself that she had spent essentially no time in noble company. Aquino was similarly dumbfounded, as even she hadn't been willing to go so far as to blurt it out quite like that. Possibly that was a side effect of her first real upbringing in noble society being influenced by the brazen nature of issei. She could only imagine the embarrassment that Ravel had to be feeling. The embarrassed girl in question looked about ready to erupt in flames. Her left eye twitched continuously in an almost violent manner as she rose to her feet. The expression causing Sarah to begin attempting to back away over the rows of coach chairs so as to put distance between herself and the murderous devil before her. Aquino began thinking as fast as she could to regain control and prevent the train becoming a battlefield, but it was Sebastian who seized the initiative by reaching out his hand and taking Rabel's right into his. At the light touch, she stopped stock still and turned to face him in a state of renewed embarrassment and shock. "Lady Phoenix, it would be my absolute pleasure if you would accompany me to dinner after this is all put to rest." A charming smile on his face with the slight blush that Aquino knew to come from a guy who meant the request that he had asked. Ravel almost seemed immobilized. She simply stared at the man with a blank expression before nodding toward him and sitting down just as abruptly as she had stood up. Her voice finally returning to her. "Yes, I would like that." Aquino could have laughed at how well that had turned out, but decided instead to give the two some space and remove Sarah from Rabel's potential wrath should she deem it still warranted. "Well, I think Sarah and I will go find another seat then," she said before standing up, turning and grabbing a hold of the young girl to bring her along. The pair sat in a booth in the next carriage. This carriage contained close to a half-dozen other passengers. However, if Aquino reached over, she could observe what the two were doing even if she couldn't hear what they said. Just because she was with Issei and Rias didn't mean she couldn't watch. In fact, she considered her committed relationship all the more reason to eavesdrop and collect some juicy gossip. "So that went well," Sarah commented as they sat down before Aquino turned to look at her with a half smirk. "I think you need to apologize to Ravel sometime. It might have worked, but I think she is still considering killing you." Sarah simply grinned back her own broad cheeky smile and rested her head on Aquino's shoulder before closing her eyes for a nap. Over the next few hours, Aquino was pleasantly excited to see the other pair talking in depth and for Sebastian to still have Rabel's hand in his. She almost gave a giddy hooray and clap when she saw Rabel's fingers interlock with his, sliding slightly and gingerly playing together after close to an hour of their holding hands. She knew that it was too much to hope for the proud yet sheltered Phoenix noble to kiss the Frenchman. The train pulled into the outskirts station near Cannes and the group disembarked. The sun was already beginning to dip as dusk approached. Moving as one, the group traveled toward their goal, with Sebastian leading the way. He had been unable to discover anything new during the train ride. That is to say, he had learned plenty about Ravel, but nothing of the target they approached. It was almost dark when the series of 8-year-old German concrete bunkers appeared in their view. They approached from the southeast toward what had previously been a platform for artillery to fire onto the beaches on D-Day. Now it was roped off so that tourists couldn't enter. Except someone recently had. In the low light, all the devils could see the footprints through the dusty ground. Too fresh to be more than a day or two old. Multiple pairs. Slipping under the rope, the group ventured forward. Sebastian knew the layout of the buildings roughly due to his research. Unable to find a specific layout, he knew that there was 5 individual above-ground structures and a simple series of underground tunnels that connected them. A command bunker in the center, predominantly underground. Forearmed with this rudimentary guide, the French retainer lead the way. Minutes ticked by in silence as the group crept through the weathered fortification. Shadows played around the corners from the moonlight and shapes flickered in the dark, yet nothing was encountered. The group, however, kept their guard up. Every member was fully aware that in both other groups' circumstance they had engaged their respective enemies. Chances were that they could well do the same tonight. Yet without incident they reached the command room and began searching around the larger space. Much of the old wartime infrastructure had been preserved. Items of military use scrapped by the Allies during the fighting, but tables, chairs, installation stations and the like all kept as part of the historical site by the local authorities. Aquino pondered if this was a dead end. It seemed unlikely. The Duke was a skilled strategist and Sebastian a potent tactician. Both agreed on the assessment of this site. As she looked around the room, she felt a tug at her sleeve from Sarah. Following the girl's silent indication, she looked over to a heavily damaged, twisted, and warped steel door. The group moved over to see that it was a heavily fortified bunker door. The burn marks around it seemed excessively old, and Aquino figured they were from weapons during the war. What caught their interest though was that the heavy door seemed to have been prized open and closed recently. Sebastian stepped forward to move the door, and yet despite his strength he was unable. All three girls stepped beside him and grasped around the side to help drag it open. Expecting a loud scrape, Aquino was surprised to find that while it made noise, the sound of it being pulled against the floor was far less than she expected. Moving into the space, Aquino found a less than pleasant sight. Heavily decomposed bodies and skeletons in Wehrmacht uniforms of varying degrees of damage or burn. The tunnel seemed to house them along its length further than she could see. Suddenly it made sense. The withdrawing Germans had made a last stand here, and the Allies had utilized flame weapons. In the process the door became wedged shut. Humans had been unable to open it without damaging the site and so left it closed. Which all but confirmed that something of supernatural origin had been the culprit to opening it up recently. Aquino turned to her team and told them to follow yet leave the door open. An ability to escape was worth the risk of detection. As they entered, Sebastian pointed forward and shrugged to indicate that he had no idea what lay ahead. This tunnel hadn't been mentioned in any of the information that he had found. Even more cautious and on edge than before, Aquino led the way forward. Before meeting Issei she had been bold, but not one to lead from the front. Again his influence had rubbed off, and now she felt it was her place to lead the way when in an unknown situation. Just like he would. The tunnel seemed to lead further into the ground and soon forked into multiple paths. Taking a guess, Aquino chose the right and followed it through to another fork where she also took the right. She was careful with where she put her feet so as to avoid the dead bodies that became a far too frequent feature of the floor. Less seemed burned and more had bullet wounds. Still not something she wanted to focus on. Coming to a third junction, she was about to choose to go right again when a noise caught her attention. A shuffling, scraping noise along with a rattling sort of shudder. It came from behind her, and Aquino turned around just as her team did the same. All four having heard the sound from behind them. The source was not something that she wanted to see. Before them stood a series of forms slowly rising up and taking a disfigured humanoid shape. Battered, decaying bodies. Torn, burnt, and stained Wehrmacht uniforms. Dull red eyes. A dozen decaying zombies. Nazi zombies. Despite everything that Aquino ever faced, she never found the prospect of the undead comfortable. The creatures revolted her. On instinct she shot her left hand forward and unleashed a spike of lightning that arced forward and toward the closest zombie as it stretched up fully. The electricity coursed through the beast. She expected some form of verbal response. A growl or scream, but all it produced was a gurgling sound as it collapsed back to the ground in a smoldering wreck. The collapse of the first acted as an instant trigger for the rest. Mouths hanging open in inhumanely spectacles, they unleashed a horrifying wail before lurching forward. Those with more sinew and structure sprinted while those with less dragged and shuffled at the small group. Sebastian stepped forward to meet them, flicking the side of his jacket aside as he did. In a flash of light, a long sword of elegant design pointed toward the foes. Ethereal energy coated the blade and dripped from it in arcs and crackles. Slicing the blade through the air, energy waves of the same as his blade cut through the air toward the charging zombies. The razor-sharp blades carved through the flesh of the beasts, much like a hot knife through butter. Yet despite the ease to which Sebastian's attacks slew them, more streamed down the twisting corridor toward the group. The sound of further roars mixing and echoing together toward them. Ravel stood beside Sebastian. the pair filling in the width of the corridor and preventing the zombies rushing past and into their group. With hands raised, she unleashed torrents of flames that incinerated the closest foes while setting the clothing and flesh of those further back aflame. "We can't stay here," Aquino stated plainly. "You both hold the rear and prevent them reaching us. Sarah, we will lead and clear the path forward. Let's go." No one argued, and the two Gremory devils led the way. Continuing with the right hand fork, the group moved forward. Now at an awkward speed of attempting to maintain forward momentum but also allowing for the rear pair to regularly turn around and unleash attacks upon their constant pursuers. Immediately red eyes stared from before them and more vile zombies approached from their front. Sarah projected volley after volley of green energy darts, her long red claws replacing her hands in case of melee combat. Aquino utilized a mixture of wind and lightning to prevent the horde closing in on them and slaying those before them. Fortunately, regardless of the speed of the dead, they still moved predictably and lacked any endurance against attacks. At the end of the day, the simple undead made a fantastic meat shield or horde to block a gap, but their lack of intelligence removed any form of versatility. This allowed the team to push through and clear the corridors they entered. In a matter of minutes, they had pushed through a series of twists and turns before hitting what Aquino had hoped to avoid: a dead end. Spinning around, she overlapped her attacks through Sebastian and Ravels in an attempt to assist their efforts. It now became a slow grind to try and push their way back through the length of tunnel they had just cleared. Over 100 zombies had fallen already before them, and yet still more flocked to them like an army of moths to a bright flame. "How many of these damn things are there?" Aquino yelled out while continuously unleashing barrage after barrage of wind gusts that served to feed and amplify the embers of Ravel's cones of flame. "I read over 800 Germans died around here, so I suppose we have that to look forward to," Sebastian replied as he shot forward and sliced through a particularly bulky zombie that had made it through the maelstrom of magic. A disgusted sigh was all Aquino responded with. She was concerned at the prospect of exhaustion. These creatures didn't take a lot to kill, but magic was a finite resource without resting. Each small spell took Shoki, and each devil only had so much that they could use. That was where a mass like this could overwhelm more potent adversaries. She suddenly wished she had Kaneko. The girl could just strike her way through them, and with the gravity training she had been putting herself though, would easily be too fast for them to catch or harm. Hopefully Sebastian could substitute well in the close quarters department if need be. Moving slower but still forward, the group pushed back to the last split they had last encountered. Where the enemy had began this encounter, the route they had taken back was so heavily packed with the dead that Aquino pushed forward into the left-hand fork. Once again the team formed the forward pair and rear guard. A large zombie lurched in a stumbling and jerky motion around a corner close into them. Aquino poured lightning and gusts of cyclonic wind into it. The wind, however, was unable to move the fiend, even as the lightning caused its muscles to spasm while it was roasted through. Sarah darted around the collapsing carcass of the larger zombie and produced a rapid succession of explosive green needles that she promptly fired toward the mass of moving bodies behind it. As the needles embedded themselves in the flesh of the creatures, her aim true, with the majority hitting necks and the cranium. Less than a second after burying in, the needle would explode in a small burst of green energy. The zombies instantly decapitated, or their heads simply evaporated before the corpse would collapse to the ground. Aquino was genuinely impressed by Sarah's action and ruffled the girl's hair as the remainder of the team moved around the overgrown corpse of the large bulbous zombie. Their tactic shifted to Sarah leading with her explosive needles and Aquino supporting. This allowed her to conserve a portion of energy and allow the trickle of Shoki to re-energize slightly as they moved. Sarah would need to switch out, but if they were smart, then this rotation could allow them to continue until their goal was complete. The horde behind them continued relentlessly, Ravel and Sebastian forming in swiftly into a cohesive pair. Efficiently thinning the flow behind them, yet it refilled immediately and constantly pressured the group as they moved forward. The zombies to their front began to lessen as they pushed down the corridor that dipped further into the earth, and before long they were moving faster as only one or two would shuffle before them to immediately receive a bolt of lightning or explosive dart that would erase it from existence. The concrete of the structure around them ended and shifted to dirt with hewn cut and decaying wooden sleepers keeping the tunnel from collapsing. This dirt continued for less than 100 meters more before Aquino could see the expanse of an open area beyond. The darkness of the tunnel becoming such that even with her enhanced vision she struggled to see what lay in the distance. Bursting into the area, multiple things happened simultaneously. First, light flared as a series of word flame lanterns around the exterior of the room burst to life, casting an ominous glow of blue light over the large area. This presented the situation to Aquino. Close to 100 zombies formed around her group in the large area. The space roughly the size of a rugby oval in both width and diameter. The group instantly stopping in their tracks. The zombies in the tunnel continued to flood into the space, however, instead of rushing, the four devils chose to split to either side and fill in the edge of the area, completing a full circle. They were now surrounded in an open area with an earthen roof too low to allow flight. Only 8 or 9 feet high. 40 or so feet of free space around their team as the zombies shuffled about. The walls of the area showed ancient stonework that had been reclaimed by the earth over the centuries. Aquino cursed internally as she began mentally preparing herself to unleash a tirade of spells, yet before she could, the zombies before her began to part. 3 figures moved through the group and Aquino was forced to grab Rabble's shoulder at the sight of the lead figure. Riser led the 3 toward them with a malicious smirk that said clearly he believed he had won. To his right stood one of the twin men with olive skin and dark features. To his left was one of the robed figures that they hadn't been able to identify. As they entered the space, the zombies closed up the gap and Riser opened his arms as if in greeting. "Welcome, welcome, so good of you to come just as we predicted you would. This is such a wonderful occasion and you all stand on truly special ground." His voice full of his overflowing cockiness. It was clear that he planned to give his self-imposing diatribe. Aquino's mind whirled as she worked to form a plan of action for this situation. If need be, she would play into his ego and keep him talking, stalling for time to allow everyone to think. This is where we have uncovered more of the ancient power that Lord Kokobile has granted ever so graciously to us. Riser continued, clearly enjoying his feeling of importance. The Nazi regime sought out supernatural power and they uncovered this ruin. With it we have gained so much more, it will be such a fitting tomb for you all, but alas, your actions have caused us harm and so now your precious Duke must die. His final words directed toward Sebastian. "What?" Sebastian spat out, "You will never be able to match my liege." Aquino was confused as she listened. If Riser knew they had come into contact with the Duke, then that could only mean one thing. Someone had told their enemy. Riser shook his head before replying, "That is true. Duke Labarton is a formidable warrior. But while I will join this assault on his estate, it will be Master Kokobile who will slay and claim his life force." "You bastard!" Sebastian retorted with barely concealed anger before darting forward, his blade cutting energy blades through the air. At this, the olive-skinned man raised his arms upward, producing a barrier of dark orange energy between Sebastian's attacks and Riser that held up to the blows. The phoenix sigil appeared beneath Riser and he spoke before vanishing. "Bring my sister's body when they are dead. I still want to absorb her life essence." With that statement made, he vanished in a flash of yellow light. His departure was clearly the order to attack and the zombies surged forward. As one, the group began unleashing spells, however Aquino kept her eyes firmly planted on the 2 figures behind the magical barrier. The olive-skinned man continued to provide power to the barrier, an action that seemed to take his full concentration and effort, while the other threw their cloak aside to present themselves. What stood before Aquino was a male figure wearing a rough set of purple pants held by an orange sash and black boots. The figure's skin was alabaster white and completely hairless. Purple tattoos covered the majority of the visible skin and the eyes of the figure a total red orb. The tattoos themselves caused Aquino to groan in disgust. Necromantic tattoos. Of course they had a necromancer. The figure immediately began to chant, and although none of the group understood what it was chanting, that didn't matter. It was obvious that the outcome would be more dead things attacking them. Aquino shouted over the group as she fired off great arcs of lightning toward converging mobs of zombies. "We have to kill the tattooed freak. Nothing more needed to be said, and Ravel turned her flames toward the energy shield that the olive-skinned man was producing. The flames crashed against the vibrant, pulsing walls, yet they refused to crack, falter, or fall. After a minute of directing her energy against them, Ravel was forced to redirect her attack towards a pocket of zombies that attempted to break into the right side of their position, where Sarah's darts were not quite numerous enough to stem the tide. Inch by inch the zombies were gaining ground, and it became evident that they would need to take to the offensive if they were going to survive. The necromancer raised his arms upward, the fingers of his hands splaying and seeming to play an invisible keyboard in time with the pitch of his chanting reaching an eerie crescendo. Skeletal hands began pushing through the dirt, dragging decomposed leather and metal armor with them. This was just what Aquino needed, even more undead. The skeletal creatures stood, a mixture of feudal warriors and Roman legionaries who'd died up to 2,000 years ago. No decaying flesh remained. Simply bone and armor. However, these fiends wielded weapons. Spears, short and bastard swords respectively. Some with round shields of the Middle Ages and others with the Roman scutum tower shield. Magic was less effective against these foes, who raised their shields and advanced. Sebastian shot forward to meet them, engaging the closest group with a flurry of strikes, parries and blows. His blade sliced through their bone, instantly destroying those it struck, and yet still others swung at him. It was evident was a formidable swordsman, but with him now engaged in melee combat, the group was at a disadvantage of less firepower to stem the zombies who continued to rise up and flow down the tunnel. Driving his sword through a shield into the skull behind it while simultaneously pivoting away from a wild sword swing and subsequently lashing out to the side to decapitate a dozen skeletons, Sebastian yelled to Aquino. "If you can hold them all for a minute, I can end this." Aquino wasn't sure if they could hold back the undying horde for a minute, but she would be damned if she was going to deny a plan if he had one. "Do it!" was all she yelled, and Sebastian disengaged from his foes before dashing into the relatively protected center of their group. He chanted a few long Latin words before cutting his sword painstakingly slow through the air from the ground to above his head. As his sword cut, the ethereal energy seemed to carve through the very fabric of reality, a rift appearing. The exertion of constantly barraging the space around them was beginning to show on all three girls as Sebastian became close to finishing his cut. The heat from the various spells building up as well as the oxygen beginning to lower. All compounding to make continued exertion harder and harder. After close to the minute that he asked for, Sebastian's rift was complete just as shuffling skeletons in what appeared to be Norse or Saxon garb began striking at Sarah. The smallest girl was fast enough to dodge their attacks but was unable to continue unleashing her darts, now being forced to weave through their blows to slash at them with her razor-sharp red claws. The claws splintered shields and deflected axes and swords alike, but close-quarter fighting still wasn't her specialty. Aquino launched lightning over her with one hand, determined to help alleviate her while holding her side as well. Sebastian took a breath, ignoring his urge to help the young girl, and plunged his blade through the rift while focusing on the area behind the energy shield. Obey its master's will, the sword, and then followed by his arm, moved through the rift and protruded out of a similar rift behind the two sentient targets. Allowing his momentum and the power to pull him, Sebastian fell through the rift and came out the other side. The olive-skinned man turned with wide eyes and attempted to raise another spell, but it was too late. In a flick of his arm, Sebastian's blade cut cleanly through both foes' necks. As their heads left the security of their shoulders, the magical barrier collapsed and chanting from the necromancer stopped in favor of the gurgling sound his bloody open neck made. Before his body could even hit the ground, a pulse of energy released that flowed harmlessly through the living yet disintegrated the dead. The only sound was one of deep panting as the four took in as much air as their lungs could get. The flames and lightning of Ravel and Aquino's spells extinguished as soon as the pair were certain that the threat was over. Sarah lay on her back, sprawled out. Clearly the young girl was exhausted. Fatigue affected them all, but now unfortunately wasn't a time to rest. "Good work," Aquino offered to Sebastian before looking up at him and continuing, "but that was so much longer than a minute, you know." "My apologies." The only words he said as he rested against the wall. It was then that Reiser's final comment came to his mind, and his exhausted expression was replaced with one of stoic duty. The Duke. We have to go to the manor. Despite their fatigue, the three girls all looked toward him and nodded in acknowledgement, with Sarah picking herself up from the ground. Sebastian wasted no time and formed the fleur-de-lis sigil of House Le Barton. When all four had entered, he activated the magic and took them to assist his home.